piecing is a great way to achieve a really accurate block. Today we're going to be sewing the paper piece template from my Purdy Bird quilt, and this is just a simple diamond block. You'll notice on the paper that there are numbers on the paper. A1, A2, A3, A4, A5, and essentially what this is this is the numerical order in which you're supposed to sew a paper piece block together. If you've never sewn a paper piece block, let me just show you a few things on how to get started with that. So first of all, what I do is I'm going to fold the template on the lines. You can do this ahead of time or you can do it during the sewing process if you'd like. All I did was simply fold the template back like this. Now when you're sewing, you're going to be sewing on the printed lines. Your fabrics are going to go on the non-printed side. So you are going to, here I've already cut out a diamond using the cutting template that I have included in the pattern, and I'm simply going to lay this on the non-printed side of the freezer paper. Now what you want to make sure that happens is that you have a seam allowance on all sides of the template. Usually I'll hold it up to the light or put it on a light box whenever I'm sewing. So right here is the A2, which is the next fabric that I'm going to be using. And that's going to be this fabric here. So I pull the fabric here, and what you do is you want to, as you're normally sewing quilt blocks, you're going to do right sides together. For some people, it might actually be a little more accurate if you pin that first fabrics in place. Normally, I'm just simply folding it over and going directly over to the sewing machine. When you are sewing the template in place, always start at there's a starting and stopping point of the actual line, and you want to put your needle down into the beginning point of the straight line. So a few securing stitches, and continue to the end. And you want to do a couple back stitches. And there you have your first line that's sewn. Flip it back over to the front side, or where your fabrics are right side up. And you always want to check and make sure, have you covered your paper template with your fabric? And here I can see that the paper template is completely covered. One thing that I always like to do is when I notice that I have a little more seam allowance than what I like, is I like to trim the seam allowance away. And you can do that using a regular ruler where you're lining up a 1/4 inch seam allowance, or you can use a add a 1/4 ruler. This ruler is great because it has a little bit of a lip here on the back side that catches, and it makes trimming a lot faster. So you're going to flip your template over, fold the paper back, and then align it. You can see here, whenever I pull on this, it just catches on the paper and holds it perfectly in place. Then you trim away the small little amount of seam allowance, and you have a perfectly lined up 1/4 inch seam allowance here. So then what you're going to do is you're going to flip your fabric over to the side, and you're ready to move on to the next one. But before you do that, there are 2 ways that you need to proceed from here. Some people use a little roller to roll out the seam allowance, and then that way there's not a lot of back and forth between the sewing machine and the iron. Here I have a little mini iron set up over here with a mini pressing board that I use for my applique, and I can just quickly go over the seam allowance before I'm ready to move on to the next fabric piece, which is going to be this one. This one is the A3, the one directly across from that. So I grab this fabric, again, right sides together, and here I'm just going to hold it and flip it over and go straight to the sewing machine. I prefer not to pin because sometimes I think the pins can get stuck. And again, back stitch at the starting and stopping points. Again, I'm going to trim my seam allowance. And then move on to the next section. There are a lot of people that prefer, whenever they are working with paper piecing, they actually prefer to lower the stitch length. I will do this slightly on my machine, but I don't lower it so much. So here, whenever I position this fabric, it's down a little bit more than what I like. I can tell here, a lot of times I'll try to fold the fabric back to see it's not covering as much of this paper as what I'd like. So I'm going to move the fabric up just a little bit, try it again, and I think that's a little bit better position. So from there, again, needle down at the starting point. Back stitch. Trim. And then iron again. Or I'm actually going to roll this one out before putting on the next piece. Again, a lot of times I'll flip the template or the fabric just to make sure that it's covering the template. And here I notice I need to move it up just a smidge. So now I'm ready to sew that last section. One last trim. And then here I'm going to iron the complete block. A lot of times I like to do even my paper piecing blocks several steps at a time. I might sew all the A1s on, or excuse me, all the A2s on, and then I'll go back and sew the A3s and do that for each one of the blocks. Now, another important thing to remember is that you always want to leave your seam allowance in here. Here's your printed line, and you need to have at least a 1/4 inch seam allowance here to accommodate for whenever you're putting the blocks together. I quickly trim away the excess fabric. And here you can see I've taken just a little smidge off. That's not so dramatic because, again, this is going to be hidden in the seam allowance. And there you have the 2 blocks.